Hello, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to INSEAD Family Business, A Force for Good webinar and digital dialogue. My name is Sonia Tatar. I'm the Executive Director of INSEAD Corporate Governance Center and INSEAD Wendell International Center for Family Enterprise. Now, for us, today we have an interesting agenda with speakers, faculty, and moderators. The first session will start, we will address how to think strategically about impact. Then we will follow with Can Family Business Be a Force for Good? We will have a 5 minutes break, and then at 10:15, our panel discussion will kick off with my colleague, Dubrule. And then after, we will actually close with the remarks. So our first speaker today and kicking off the first session is Professor Jasjit Singh. He's Professor of Strategy at INSEAD. He's also the Paul Dubrule Chaired Professor of Sustainable Development. This session will be also moderated by our moderator, Martin Roll, who is Distinguished Fellow for INSEAD Wendell International Center for Family Enterprise. He's entrepreneur in residence at the INSEAD Center for Entrepreneurship. He's a business and brand strategies senior advisor, Martin Roll Company. So we're ready to kick off. We're ready to start the first session, and over to you, Jasjit and Martin. Thank you.
My name is Jasjit Singh. It's a pleasure to be here. Having a chance to share some thoughts with you on thinking strategically about impact. And of course, this is a topic of concern to family businesses, but this is a topic of concern to society more broadly. And I'm going to start with a question for you, which is a poll, just to warm us up, because we talk a lot these days about business as a force for good. And I want to see how people feel about this topic. So if you could just take a second to think about this question, to what extent do you really agree or disagree with the statement that in terms of its net impact on society, in recent decades, business has served as a strong force for good? And to answer this question, you would have to go on the website that's indicated on top of the slide. It's pollev.com/JSINGH600. And I want to get a sense of how people feel about this. So please feel free to take out the website and try to give an answer. So we can start to see the trends a little bit. So it feels like the most common answer is somewhat agree, which is people do have some reservations, but on the whole, it looks like people somewhat agree. There are some, the second most common category is somewhat disagree, somewhat strongly agree, and then the third is somewhat disagree. And I think this is quite reflective of how a lot of us, at least in the business community, feel about this topic, which is it's a little bit of a mixed bag, which is to a large extent, certainly we have to note that there's a lot of progress that has been made on pulling close to 1 billion people out of poverty, on which has led to economic growth that has led to significant improvements on other indicators like child mortality, maternal health, education, and so on. But there's a lot of work to be done, as these books recently that have come out have raised issues around the environment, issues around inequality. And so I think we'll be fooling ourselves if we just at this point started congratulating ourselves on business as a force for good. We have a lot more work to do as well. And that's what we are here about, to have a discussion. And we are having a general discussion about impact right now. And in the second half, we'll talk a lot more about connecting that to family business specifically. So with that, let me go to a second poll question. And the way you answer that is exactly the same. If you already are on that website, you should be able to answer this question now. And the question is this is a reasonably famous quote. There are some principles in human nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So who is the person who made this quote? Is it Donald Trump? Is it Adam Smith? Is it Milton Friedman? Is it Mother Teresa? So let's see what people feel about this. Okay, so a majority of people, about half of the people think it's Adam Smith, and a quarter each Milton Friedman and Mother Teresa. And the right answer actually is Adam Smith. And this does come as a surprise to a lot of people, because normally we associate Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations, where the conversation is a lot about how self-interest is a sufficient condition sometimes to produce efficiency, because prices are seen as a signal of value in society. But this did not, to Adam Smith, mean that people were just inherently selfish. It was about the market mechanism being an efficient organizing mechanism under certain conditions. But more generally, he, like most of us, believe that human nature is a lot more complex than that simple characterization in economic models. And we do want to do well, even as business people. And that certainly is my experience in talking to hundreds and hundreds of people over the years when they look at the external environment. But the reality also we have to recognize as business people is that that's not how sometimes we're seen. And the stereotypical image of the business person is this person who only cares about money. And this is, of course, leading to a divide in the society that we should be very concerned about, and we should be trying to make progress on. For example, with people that are talking about environmental issues. Certainly there's almost seems to be a generational divide, with the younger people being more likely to be on the streets and talking about business. So, and the COVID obviously is another wake-up call, which is in itself, it's a painful event, but it also can be a precursor to much bigger battles that lie ahead in terms of social upheaval and climate change. And this highlights really the urgency of some of these issues. And on the inside, we also see time and again that most business leaders do want to do well for society, not just for themselves, and yet they feel constrained about how to do more, right? And so it's almost like they're caught up in a system, and we want to say, how do we make progress in these constraints? For example, when we have this paradigm of shareholder value, what does that mean, and what does that allow us to do or not do? Now, a lot of us sort of give up on our work life, and we say our sense of fulfillment comes from something beyond that. Like we go to these 10-day meditation retreats like I've gone to, or we go volunteering to nonprofits. In this case, here I am, house building in Cambodia, though I have zero skills for doing that. But the question we really have to ask ourselves, is this necessary, or is this the only way, more importantly? And perhaps we could think a little harder about how can we find purpose and make a contribution within the context of our everyday work, rather than feeling the need to do things after working hours and during weekends and holidays when we contribute to society. So the question in my mind is really, if you think about your impact is the difference between the world when you're a part of the world and the world when you're not a part of the world. And delta is what your impact is. And just to be clear about it, here's an example, right? So if this was a paragliding center in the UK, actually 2 of them, and they were sponsoring people to jump out of planes to raise money for charity. But in the process, their processes were loose. A lot of these were first-time paragliders, and many of them ended up, hurting themselves. And the end result was that the money that they raised was actually much less than the total cost to the UK health system in terms of just taking care of their injuries. So in the bigger scheme of things, despite the fact that these were well-intentioned people, this was not really leading to significant impact. And this is a broader issue we have to bear in mind, which is what outcomes are we really enabling rather than just feeling good about ourselves? What is the effectiveness in achieving these outcomes? And are there unintended consequences we also need to deal with? And so specifically, the way I think about impact is we really have to start with asking the question, how can we best contribute? So we have to start with the problem. What really is the societal concern? For example, the Sustainable Development Goals. What are your strengths? Maybe you're a business person, so your strength really is coming up with new kinds of business models where you would contribute. And then, of course, all of that done in the context of your own goals, which could be, maybe there is some particular things you feel strongly about. Maybe you feel strongly about inequality issues. Maybe you feel strongly about gender issues. And so that's what you should try to do. And maybe you have a lot of money, so your goal is how to use that money effectively, while in another setting you might have the skills but you don't have the money, so you might be contributing in a different way. But it really is connecting back to how do we maximize our impact, rather than just asking how do we feel good about ourselves in doing something for society. And so in that context, I'm just going to briefly talk about 4 broad conversations that are happening in the impact arena. The first is business is not just a means for making money, it's also a tool. And it's also a tool, if you want, for having impact. And to me, a very inspiring example of that is a family business called Patagonia, based out of California, which is all about responsible consumption. But these are not a bunch of just do-gooders. This is a serious business that's being run, where the competitive advantage of the company comes from a strong sense of mission about responsible consumption and spreading the message of responsible consumption. And their essentially value proposition to the customers is, normally you should not be buying anything, because anything that you buy has an environmental cost. You should buy only when you need something. But when you do buy, of course, you should buy our clothing, because our clothing is high quality, it lasts longer. So you buy one of ours and you won't have to buy 4 of the competitors over the coming years. So they found a way to align their sense of environmental mission with what is the source of their competitive advantage. So Patagonia would be what I call an impact business. Of course, that's not the only way businesses contribute to society, even if they have a deliberate intention of doing so. The other 2 models are what I call sustainable business, which is typically larger public companies. And the focus is much more on environmental, social, and governance risks, and at least at a minimum managing that, because if you don't even do that, your business is in serious trouble in today's environment. And the other extreme is a social enterprise, where you're just saying, business is still a useful tool, but I want to work with populations on problems where it's very hard to come up with a profitable business model. So I would have to, in the end, take compromises, but I'm still going to do it through a business model rather than a pure charity model. So that's the first point. The second point is thinking of investing as a tool, which in a way is a mirror image of business as a tool, because the enterprises that are trying to have impact obviously need somebody who's willing to fund them. And here I have an example of Credit Suisse, because I worked closely with them and written a case study on them. And their Asia Impact Investing Fund invested in this enterprise or business, which has been doing extremely well, called Ruanguru, which is all about inclusive access to support for education using technology. So it's in Indonesia, it targets low-income families. And the idea is a lot of people in remote areas, they either don't have tutors or they don't have access to tutors. So these kids are at a disadvantage in terms of future opportunities, for example, in getting into college. But if you can give them access to really low-cost, high-quality educational tools, think of it as Khan Academy of Indonesia, they can do much better. And so this is a case in which the business has been doing exceptionally well as a part of the Credit Suisse portfolio. At the same time, it has also been able to do impact in terms of affecting millions and millions of lives positively. Again, impact investing is just one lens. If you're a more mainstream financial institution and impact investing is not your cup of tea, at a minimum, you need to be looking at sustainable and responsible investing, which already is a pretty mainstream lens of investing. Almost, depending on who you ask, about 1/3 of all assets under management globally are already done with this lens. And the other side is, well, even if you're a philanthropy, let's say your Gates Foundation, a lot of times you find it useful to invest rather than just give a grant to a social enterprise, because you feel that this way you're enabling business models, you're making the social enterprise slowly strengthen to a point where it can be a self-sustaining business, it's strengthening its own systems, and it encourages more innovation, discipline, efficiency, and all of that. So again, investing, thinking of it as a tool rather than just as a way of making money. The third bucket I want to talk about, and I think this is perhaps less recognized, but is becoming increasingly relevant, is this notion of impact strategy, which is normally when we think about having impact, we are very rigorous on the business side, but on the impact side, we tend to go just with stories. But having an impact strategy means you need to think as carefully about how do you have impact, and do you really have impact the way you would in building a business model. So if you will, it's almost like having an impact model hand in hand with a business model, and at least asking questions on, are you really having the impact that you set out to have. So example of that would be, think about fair trade. At some level, it's a great thing. It's about bringing, fair wages to farmers, giving them slightly higher prices. But if you double click, you have to be very careful at how you manage all of that, because if what happens is in your fair trade ecosystem, the only farmers that come are the farmers that are relatively large, the farmers that are well connected, the farmers that have money to get the certification, then what you might be doing is, yes, you might be benefiting some of the farmers, but it might come at the expense of other farmers, which are smaller farmers, who are not so well educated, who are not aware of this movement, and you might be taking business away from the smaller farmers and handing it to bigger farmers. So these are the unintended side effects or unintended consequences you have to look out for. So if you really have an impact strategy, you have to be very clear of how you're affecting people's lives, and to what extent might you actually be producing negative effects more broadly, and what are you going to do to mitigate that? Right? So when we think about impact strategy, what we are asking is, what problem are we solving? For whom are we solving that problem? And we don't stop just at what in the business world is essentially outputs, which is how many customers showed up, how many products did we sell? The question we ask is, what outcomes are realized? And did we really change lives? Which is, are we really better than others at contributing to society? And what in the end is our net impact? Not just the positive things, but taking into account the negative things. In the fair trade case, the question would be, okay, how much did we actually affect those farmers' lives versus perhaps distorting markets and reducing demand because prices are now higher? But on the unintended harm side, we'll ask the question, did we end up excluding poorer farmers? And are we going out of our way then to somehow make up for that and reduce that unintended harm that we would otherwise perhaps have caused? So the fourth and final conversation point I want to just briefly touch upon is this idea of innovative collaboration, which is, if you're thinking of having an impact, very often your impact could be much bigger if you don't try to be a lone hero, but you actually try to see what are you good at and how can you fit what you're doing with what is being done in a broader ecosystem at contributing to society. And just to briefly talk about the journey of a Hong Kong-based family office called RS Group. So in the beginning, they were shifting their traditional portfolio to a portfolio with more of an impact lens, where they said, okay, our liquid assets we will turn into more ESG, sustainable investing kind of investments, and our illiquid assets, we will move them into more impact investing kind of investments. So that was the first piece of their impact journey. But then what they realized was their impact could be much bigger if they went further and if they served as a platform and a role model for other Hong Kong-based families. So they were one of the key players in setting up this initiative called Sustainable Finance Initiative in Hong Kong, which now has about 20 family offices involved, and they're very heavily engaged with, for example, the educational ecosystem and making people aware of issues around, let's say, sustainable development goals, making people aware on how they can positively contribute to all of that, and how investment can be indeed used as a tool for impact and not just as a tool for making money. So just winding up for the last 2 minutes or so with a couple of closing thoughts after just pointing out the fact that innovative collaboration in the end is about not just one kind of player. This is about saying how do different kinds of players, private players, public player, perhaps foundations, non-profits, they can all come together. There's a finance side of it for which these days the buzzword is blended finance, which is how do we enable, rather than just saying, what do we do with our money? What do we do with our effort in isolation? We just say, how can we use it in a best possible way that we also enable a more mainstream involvement on issues of impact, even by people who would normally not think of being players in the impact space. And that becomes a powerful tool of thinking about all of this. But in the end, I would say, I think it's really a journey. It's not that you can, take the PowerPoint slides I have and just saying, okay, so we'll make it into a business plan and go execute. As we know in the business world, that's not how enterprises are built. It's a long journey. It's a learning journey where you go in with a little bit of humility and a sense that you will learn on the way. And you have to have the same mindset, perhaps even more so, saying, yes, you have certain skills and maybe you even have solutions in mind, but you have to go in with the humility that what you have in mind might not work as such, and you might have to learn over time. And I think as long as that spirit of learning, collecting feedback, being rigorous, collecting data, constantly improving is there, you will do better. So it's not like we have to wait till we feel we are perfect. I think everybody can start on this journey as long as you start with sort of a humble mindset that, yes, we can do it. We don't have to do it together. And we are here to learn together and contribute together rather than just doing our own thing, feeling good about what we're doing and being the lone savior of the world. I think that rarely works. So just a couple of last points. One is there's a tendency to think, hey, I'm too small. I'm not Gates Foundation. Gates Foundation has 100 billion. I have nothing. What can I do? And I think if you compare yourself with this quote, if you think you're too small to have an impact, try going to bed with a mosquito in the room. I think if the mosquito can do things, I'm sure all of us can do things as well. And just as one last closing slide to finish on a note of inspiration from Nelson Mandela, there really is no passion to be found playing small in settling for a life less than the one that you're capable of living. And I think this is where the opportunity, the big opportunity, and this is something that my colleague Morten would come in his talk in the second half, is for family offices, which is the big companies. Very often, if you're in a big company, you feel much more constrained. You don't have the decision power. There's this idea of this diffuse investor who only cares about shareholder value and all of that. And that's a separate discussion on how to make progress on that dimension. But the nice thing about families is that you have the ability and the flexibility to think more long-term, to bring in your values in a stronger way than a manager would just in a public company, and hence contribute to the world perhaps by really being a leader, not just in doing your own thing, but then carrying along a broader community and trying to make a contribution in that way. So with that, I think it's a good time to stop, and I will let my colleague Martin come in, and we can have some minutes of question and answer right there.
Fantastic. Thanks to Professor Jasjit Singh. We're going to move into a Q&A. This was a very enlightening opening. Thanks for sharing. And also great to be here. I'm Martin Roll, and I'm going to take you through the Q&A. Before we launch it, you will see there is as Sonia told you this morning, there is a Q&A button in your screen. So please go ahead. We have received the first questions and we'll launch it. So while we get into this 10-minute segment, feel free to shoot your questions out to us. Thanks, Jasjit. Amazing opening here on a topic which I'm sure we can go on for days here. It's a very enlightening one. The first question has come in here, which is will be confronted with a lot of poverty. So also the rich people or the rich families will be looked upon. How do you think the family business world can be more proactive in managing this, and maybe in a post-COVID world? How should family firms play their competitive advantages?
Yes, absolutely. And connecting it back to some of the broader thoughts that I had earlier, I think it's very important in a world in which increasingly there's this divide, for example, on issues of inequality. It is natural that families will come under scrutiny. So the starting point to note is that it's not even a luxury that you have of saying we want to be altruistic, we want to be nice to the world. It's an imperative, which is if you don't do it, it's like the license to operate in the society wouldn't be there. And as families, as we've already seen in some countries and in recent years in Korea, for example, families come exceptionally under scrutiny very often because of the wealth and power that they have. But I think this is also an opportunity that to the extent that you really have the flexibility of setting your own agenda, if somebody somewhere is saying, oh, the only paradigm to look at the world is shareholder value paradigm. Well, that paradigm is created for a setting in which you have diffuse investors where, and it's assumed that the average investor only cares about money and that's it. But if you own the family, why do you have to even start with this assumption that that paradigm is what I need to be using? And especially given that I think increasingly we're seeing this in a lot of families where the new generation very often, A, wants to engage more in societal issues, B, is sometimes not interested in family business, right? And the solution in some sense to both of these is if you start with a conversation around what are our common values as a family and how can we bring that into our business and our investing, this becomes a way both to strengthen the family, to increase the length of what you're able to do internally, and also engage more fruitfully with the society. It absolutely has to start with values.
Yeah, very good. You said license to operate. I think that's a very cue for me on that one. You kind of almost tapped into it, because the next question is about the next generation. We have with us today many from family firms, our students at INSEAD. We have many students from Next Gen in the global family firms. One question here, they're often very inclined to get into impact investing. And there are a lot of initiatives globally. So what are some of the key trends that you see, and what is creating kind of value in impact investing, and what are some of the tips that you will give today on that one?
I would say two things. One is, even before you decide specifically on whether impact investing per se is the right thing for you, you need to have a conversation about what are, in addition to your values, what are your goals, right? And how ambitious do you want to be? So in a lot of families, the start of the journey actually is in the broader sustainable / responsible investing space, because it is a much more mainstream space in which it's still more liquid, public companies and so on that are there. Start there saying, how is our portfolio doing in terms of environmental, social, and governance factors? But then if you feel ready to engage at the next level, saying, how are we contributing to societal issues? Absolutely, I think impact investing is a fascinating new growth area. And I was at a next generation event with Credit Suisse in Phuket last year. And all major banks at this point do events like this, because that's exactly the conversation point, which is they're realizing that the next generation is hungry to contribute. A lot of times they end up doing so by rebelling against the family, working for a nonprofit somewhere, and not necessarily with a lot of impact. But if you bring it back into a conversation on, hey, you don't have to go out there to do good. Can we have a conversation on how we can do good with what we're already doing, both in how we invest and how we do business? Potentially the impact is much bigger, and the chances that you can keep your family together are also much higher.
Yeah. Question here about evaluation, because what are we really getting out of it? How do you evaluate the impact as of course family firms try to assess what are we really achieving in this field? How advice would you give them in terms of assessing the outcome? How do you evaluate?
So a couple of thoughts here. The first is connecting back to what I was saying earlier, which is what is your ambition, right? And just be very honest to yourself, which is are you doing this so that you can feel good about doing something good for society, and you really feel particularly passionate about a specific nonprofit, specific cause and all of that, then maybe it's not worth you going down this path. But if you really are serious about saying, okay, I'm devoting my time, energy, and money to this, so I want to have the maximum impact, you really have to have the conversation that extends beyond just the obsession with scale, how many lives did we save, to asking how much difference did we really make. Now, some of the evaluation you might be able to do within your enterprises, but the reality is it's a much more complex exercise. But there's a lot of evidence emerging out there, for example, from external research, from evidence-based, from experts that are working in this space. So I would say, don't start on an evaluation journey as an independent project. Think of what causes you're operating on, and try to find experts that are able to engage with you on that. And where is the evidence on, for example, if you care a lot about malaria, let's say, go out there and say, what is it that's most effective in cost effectiveness and outcomes on reducing malaria-related deaths? Or if you care about educational outcomes, don't just say, I want to build more libraries, or I want to build, distribute bicycles so that kids can go to school. Those are all solutions. Start with a problem, which is literacy happening? And then see what is the evidence on cost effectiveness of different solutions and try to go in that direction. Those are the tough questions to ask, really.
Fantastic. We just have space for a quick reply to the last one here. There are so many certifications and standards out there in terms of B Corp, Fair Trade, GRI, and many, many others. How does one go about making sense of which one to proceed? What should we really do here? Just a quick answer to that one.
So just a couple of quick thoughts on just slicing and dicing, right? We can't go into the specific standards here, but one is to say a lot of the standards are about outputs, and other standards might be about outcomes. The reality is actually there's a lot more on outputs than outcomes, and that's important to bear in mind. The other distinction to bear in mind is, are these standards about reducing the harm you're producing, for example, on the environmental, social, and governance factors, and there's a bunch of standards coming there, versus do you want to go further and say, how do I contribute to positively having impact on any of the sustainable development goals? And those would be a different kind of site. And the last always is, do you go sector specific versus general? If you're very focused on sectors, sometimes sector specific standards might be good enough. In fact, might be better. But if you want to be more general, then you should look at standards that are more across the board, because if you really are trying to construct portfolios which go across sectors, you have to bear that in mind as well.
Fantastic. Jasjit Singh, Professor at INSEAD, thanks so much for sharing this morning. This was a great opening. We're going to move on. Thanks,
Martin,
for sharing.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great to be here online. Thanks a lot.